Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, Beyond the Big Five. Discover Africa's lesser known animals. Presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Lorraine Doyle. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Take it away, Lorraine.
Hi, Rob. Thank you very much for that. And thanks again for the opportunity to be able to present a webinar. Um, so, as you said, in terms of the title, called it Beyond the Big Five. And part of the reason for thinking about or selecting this topic is that very often when we go on safari, there is a lot of focus on the big five, but often we see many of these animals that I'm going to talk about today more frequently. And so I thought it was just a good idea to showcase them perhaps a little bit. Many of them are also incredibly photogenic. And so, yeah, just to delve into them and give them a little bit more of the spotlight. So this antelope that is on the screen at the moment, this is a female kudu. And yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about kudus later on in the presentation. So yeah, just a picture of yours truly for anyone who hasn't joined before or hasn't met me. Taken in Botswana a year ago. One of my favorite habitats. Um, so, so the first animal that I chose as part of this presentation is what is known as the plain zebra, scientific name Equus quagga. May also have heard of it referred to as Burchell's zebra. Burchell's zebra was split off from the plain zebra quite a few years ago now, just based on genetic evidence that suggested that the populations had been geographically isolated for long enough that you'd had speciation occurring. And so in this part of southern Africa, we now have Equus quagga, and further east, going up into East Africa, you have Equus burchellii. But to all intents and purposes, if you look at them just in terms of their what we call their phenotype, so what they morphologically look like, you would never know the difference. So I found this a couple of these slides put together by somebody called Dion Furstenberg, and I just thought they were quite nice, just to kind of give a bit of an overview, if you will, of the species. So, and then also, despite the fact that they have a spelling error on their slide, but just to give an idea of size, kind of size differential relative to a human, it just helps perhaps give some sort of perspective. So zebras, obviously, I think most people would be able to recognize them as the horses in striped pajamas. And yes, very closely related to horses. They belong in the same genus, the genus Equus. And as a result, they have a very similar spoor. Their spoor or their footprint looks exactly like that of a horse. So a single toe with that soft spot in the back known as the frog. And so zebras are what we call non-selective bulk feeders. So zebras just need to eat a lot of grass, but not particularly concerned about the quality of the grass. And as you can see, zebras are obviously particularly photographic in black and white. They just really stand out in that in that medium, but they also look really good in color. And you can see in this one that these guys have got what we call shadow stripes. So in between the black and white stripes, you've got almost like a rusty color stripe, and that's typical of this particular species of zebra. So in South Africa, we have another species known as the Cape Mountain zebra, and Cape Mountain zebra don't have those shadow stripes. The other thing that's interesting about zebras is, and the same goes for horses, you can tell the health of the zebra. So this is a very healthy zebra because its mane is standing upright. So that mane is kept in that sort of position by having an underlying supporting layer of fat. And if the animal is in poor condition, you'll find that that mane will actually drop down, and then you'll have an indication that this animal is not particularly healthy. Because they're what we call hind gut fermenters, they always look plump, but that's not generally the fact that they're in good condition. A lot of that is gas as a result of the process of fermentation, and so it's not a particularly good indicator of their health. But their main is. So this was quite an interesting photograph. I took this in Madikwe Game Reserve, which is one of the reserves we go to on the secluded South Africa safari. And this is what we call a sodic site or a sodic area. And during the dry season, when the nutritive content of the grasses is not particularly high, you'll find quite a lot of animals, zebras included, will come and they will actually lick the salt in the soil. It's a process known as geophagia, or the eating of soil. And they're doing that to get the nutritive content, the salt content that they require in their diets. So they also can be very photogenic against sort of sunsets, a little bit backlit, lovely contrast. This is quite a young one, and you can see it still has quite a fluffy appearance. People may also have heard that a zebra's stripes are as unique as fingerprints, and that's correct. So no zebra have an identical stripe pattern. And what's also quite interesting is, so they live in little family groups, often referred to as a harem. So there'll be a male stallion and a number of females. But when a female is going to give birth, she'll actually leave the group for the first few days of the foal's life. And that's because the foal will actually imprint on the stripes on the side of the mother's face. And that is how it knows in a group of striped animals that this is its mother. And so that whole imprinting process is really quite important. The other thing that you'll notice with these animals is at some point when they are going to start, the foal will start eating grass, they actually need to eat the dung of the adult in order to get the microbes to populate their gut, which enable them to then break down the cellulose in the grass that they are eating. They're not born with that. So yeah, just a couple of things that are important to them. So this kind of behavior is really quite typical. You'll get a whole line of them lining up to drink, and often sharing water sources with a number of other animals like these impalas. And then there's always one that has to be facing in the opposite direction. So yeah, you have this lovely shot with all these zebras' heads lined up, and then one decides, no, it has to turn its head in the opposite direction. You'll see they quite often will go quite deep into water to drink, um, trying to avoid the really muddy water on the edge of the pan very often. But yeah, these are the sort of photographs that are often really nice photographs to get on safari. Quite difficult. They'll often drink in the middle of the day, so light can often be quite harsh. So not necessarily the easiest pictures to take. But you can see the shadow striping very clearly on the one that's behind the one that's facing the wrong direction. That sort of rusty, it's not dirty. Those are shadow stripes. So quite close bond between foal and mother. And that bond will last for a considerable period of time. Zebras actually, particularly the stallions, can be quite aggressive. So not infrequently you'll see, particularly males, the stallions without tails. It's not that they've been attacked by lions, it's that one male has bitten off the tail of another in some sort of dominant scuffle. So yeah, relatively close social bonds, but by the same token, when it comes to competition within the groups, they can be, as I say, biting, kicking as well. They have got a very, very strong kick. So yeah, not something to be trifled with. And then sometimes they do amusing things. This picture was also taken at Madikwe. We were having a coffee break, and this zebra wandered up to this dead tree stump and decided that it was time to have a little bit of a back scratch. So yeah, sometimes make for amusing photographs. And then often associated with giraffes, quite a number of animals will associate with giraffes. And part of that reason is, we believe, giraffes, because of the virtue of their incredibly long necks, they have a much greater range of vision. And so they are able to give the alarm of a predator much sooner than an animal like a zebra would be able to see it, just by sheer virtue of being able to see above the trees. And so this kind of relationship between giraffe, zebra, impala, wildebeest, they're relatively common to see them in these sort of mixed groups. And this just so happened that this was a giraffe and with a youngster. So another animal that is very widely seen on African safaris, perhaps most associated with East Africa's migration, is our blue wildebeest. Called blue because it has a sort of a bluish tinge to it. Again, very can be very photogenic in black and white, and they there are a number of different subspecies, and not all of them are highly migratory. Within southern Africa, we don't really have migratory populations any longer, mainly because we have fences around reserves, partly because we now have roads, we have cities, and so there just isn't the option of these animals migrating over long periods as they may have historically done following the rain. So that is really what drives the big wildebeest migrations of East Africa. And even that migration has been substantially curtailed. We know from historic records that that migration that happens in Tanzania used to come all the way down as far as southern Africa. And that was part of the migratory route of these wildebeest, and to a lesser extent of the zebra. But that whole route and migration has now stopped. I mean, we know that in I think it was the 1980s when a lot of the foot and mouth fences went up in Botswana. There was talk that there was probably at least 50,000 wildebeest that died because these fences had cut off their migratory routes to water, which became a particularly pronounced problem when you had drought conditions. Um, so again, just they have these sort of slit pupils, a bit like I can't remember if goats go the same direction if they're vertical, but they have quite interesting eyes. This one had been rubbing his head in the mud, which is something that, again, they have scent glands. So the males are quite territorial. They'll have establish these territories. And one of the things that they do is that they will horn the ground, scent mark, in order to demarcate their territory. Just out of interest, fairly random, but the scientific genus name, Connochetus, is actually derived from Greek, with konos meaning beard, and the chetus denoting flowing hair or mane, which pretty much describes their appearance. So they have this sort of beard, and also their mane. So they often will come down to water like the zebras do in these groups. But it's really quite interesting to watch that one of them, for whatever reason, will get startled by something. It could be as much as another one sneezing. And then suddenly they all will scatter. So that's clearly a survival instinct. Being at any form of water hole for a prey species is a very dangerous place to be, because obviously when you're drinking and your focus is not necessarily around, your situational awareness has dropped, you're at risk of predation. And so that's why you get these kind of immediate responses, and despite the fact that in this instance there wasn't actually any risk, they all bolted from the water. So this is just another sort of scene where you see wildebeest. They're very selective feeders, selective grazers. They really like short grass. And so often you'll find them with zebra. So zebra are not choosy. They just eat a lot of grass, whereas these guys are really choosy, and they eat high quality but less of it. And then these are youngsters. A couple of them you can see are youngsters. The horns don't have that complete outward bend yet. And so, yeah, a little family group. And then the white birds with them are cattle egrets. They'll often follow them around when the wildebeest or zebra are moving through the grass. They'll disturb insects, and the cattle egrets will then get a snack, and that's why they often you'll see them together. So another, I think, African or safari favorite is the giraffe. So in South Africa we have the South African giraffe, Giraffa camelopardus giraffa. So there are other species in other parts of Africa. but this is the only one that we have in southern Africa. So again, just a sort of overall picture of them. So very characteristic. They're very unlikely to ever be confused with any other animal. The one thing that is sometimes confused is their tracks. People will sometimes mistake buffalo spoor for giraffe spoor, but I think other than that, they're very unlikely to be confused. So the giraffe name, as far as we know, was used in Arabia. It's an Arabic name, and it comes from the word zarafa, meaning fast walker. And they have a very unusual gait. They do walk relatively fast, but unlike most quadrupeds, which will cross what we call crossover in the midline when they walk, so they'll put left front foot forward, then back right foot, and then the converse. If giraffe did that, they'd fall over their feet. And so they will put left front, left back, right front, right back. And it can look really quite awkward. And they look particularly awkward when they run because they kind of put both front legs forward and then their back legs come past that. So they look a little ungainly when they run. So in Zulu, the Zulu language, giraffe are known as Ndulamiti, which means the one who is taller than the trees. So a tree is Biamiti, so this is Ndulamiti. And as you can see in this instance, it's quite a nice example of where you have a giraffe that is taller than the trees. So they have these, I always find them rather endearing faces, very mobile lips, which enable them to get in between these thorns of their preferred food source. Also very long eyelashes for that purpose as well. It actually protects them because they'll sense the thorns against their eyelashes before they get poked in the eye. And this is a typical shot of when they've got half a mouthful. And so you can literally watch them. They are ruminants, they're the largest ruminants, and it is really very entertaining to watch the cud ball come all the way up their long neck, and then they churn, and then you watch the cud ball go all the way back down their long neck. But you can see quite clearly here those very long eyelashes. And you can see a little bit of the pollen that it's picked up on the top of its nose. And giraffe are considered one of the largest mammal pollinators because when they go and they are feeding, they are sticking their heads into flowers. They get pollen on their head and also on their ossicones, which is the correct name for their horns. They're not true horns. On top of their head, and then they go to the next flower and they translocate the pollen. And so by doing that, they're taking pollen from tree to tree to tree. So that's potentially one of their roles. It's not that these trees rely solely on giraffe to be pollinated, and they have a lot of insect pollinators, but giraffe do play a part. And you can kind of get a sense here of that very mobile upper lip, which is allowing them to bypass the thorns. The trees also, interestingly, you'll watch giraffe and they'll feed on a tree for a while and then they'll just suddenly move off. And that's because the tree is raising its chemical defenses. It's releasing more tannins. Tannins are very bitter, so the palatability decreases, and so the giraffe will go on to the next tree. But they've got to make sure that they're browsing in a direction that is not affected by the chemical transfer on the wind that is actually notifying other trees in the area that we're under attack, in inverted commas, and then those trees will preemptively raise their tannin levels. So yeah, sometimes it can be a little bit of a race against time in the wind. Otherwise, they have to move a much further distance to where that chemical communication hasn't yet made it. So another thing that's really always interesting to watch and can be quite photographic is giraffes drinking. They pretty much have to do the splits in order to be able to get their neck down low enough to get to water. And obviously this is a very vulnerable time for giraffes, so they're very nervous drinkers. I think we watched this giraffe. I think it probably took it about 20 minutes to finally get the courage to come and go down to drink. But yeah, eventually it did, but it definitely took a while. You'll notice in this picture as well that you can see very clearly the white behind the ears of the giraffe. White like this, sometimes you'll see it, whether it's a tail flash on other species or a ring around their rump. We believe these are follow me signs. And so this is a color that stands out in the bush and can be seen from a distance by other giraffe, and so it enables them to locate one another. And then this is another, sometimes they won't stretch their legs completely. They'll do this kind of bending motion, going down, coming up. Really doesn't look very comfortable and is pretty ungainly. And then this particular giraffe just seemed to have an inordinate number of oxpeckers on it. This was just on its neck alone. And so that can sometimes indicate the health of the animal. If they've got a very high parasite load, because the oxpeckers are obviously taking off ticks, they'll be inundated with oxpeckers. I'm not sure if that was the case here. It didn't look in a particularly bad condition, but yeah, it just seemed to be a bit of an oxpecker magnet on that particular day. And you'll see the giraffe or any animal will be relatively tolerant to a point, and then they'll get annoyed with the oxpeckers and they'll shake them all off. And part of the reason for that is oxpeckers don't perch on the animal; they actually hang on their hide, and so they've got needle sharp little claws, and so it gets pretty uncomfortable. And that's potentially why they will also just get annoyed and shake them off. You may ask how I know that oxpeckers have incredibly sharp beak. We have one on the reserve where I'm based that we were given because it had fallen from a nest, and we didn't actually know what it was initially. And unfortunately, it had a damaged wing, so we couldn't release it completely. And so we have a half, I suppose you can say we have a tame oxpecker. And yeah, when it jumps around and comes and sits on your arms, it can get quite uncomfortable. This was just a close-up of the eyelashes, and also just you can sort of see the fur around the eyes. So one of the things that's very interesting to watch with giraffe is that the males will have these sort of necking competitions. So this is their way of fighting. This was just play. This was definitely just play fighting, learning techniques of how to knock one another off balance. But when two bulls fight properly, it's a very violent affair, and they use a huge amount of force. because they've literally got this kind of wrecking ball head on top of that neck, and they can do a lot of damage to one another. And then this is just when giraffes are very young. The ossicones haven't yet been worn down, and so they have these tufts. And this one just had a particularly fascinating set of tufted ossicones. They just look like paintbrushes on top of his head. And giraffes can also make really, really good sunset subjects if you can get them silhouetted against the sky. Pretty good subjects for sunset photos. The waterbuck. So two species within Africa. The one at the top is the one that we get in southern Africa and occurs through much of Africa. The Dafasa waterbuck kind of occurs in areas, Somalia, sort of going further up into east and sort of northeast Africa. Doesn't have the same characteristic ring around the rump, just has two white patches on either side of the rump, but otherwise materially looks quite similar. So females do not have horns, only the males do. And yeah, this was a sort of a family group of them. The thing I love about them is that they just have these lovely heart-shaped noses, which just also makes them very photographic. So this is a beautiful big male. As you can see, they have this very kind of shaggy coat, and it's covered in an oil that has quite a distinctive odor. And they're called waterbuck because their primary defense when they come under attack is to run into water. So they're not highly aquatic antelope like things like Sitatunga are that you find in the Okavango Delta. But one of their defense strategies is that when under threat, they will run into water. And this is just to show there's a male and a female together. So yeah, quite stocky looking antelope. So this one was two males having a bit of a sparring match. And then there was a photo bomb of a southern ground hornbill, which was a really nice photo bomb because obviously southern ground hornbills are endangered, and it was a real treat to have this one run across the picture. But the original intention had been to catch the two sparring young waterbuck males. So just another one, just showing them in their sort of habitat, often down near water, riverine areas. I think this one was feeding, it looks like. There may have been some papyrus there that it was feeding on. And then this, they'll, if there is the availability of sort of waterborne or water plants, they'll go into water and find those plants and eat them. And that's what this male had been doing. He'd been finding some of the water sort of grasses and had been feeding on them. And then, yeah, just showing this one wasn't particularly fleeing from anything, but very at home in water, as their name would suggest. So in the beginning, I said that the animal there was a kudu. So it's actually a greater kudu. We only have the greater kudu in this part of Africa. And it's one of our largest antelope, and only the male has horns, and those are actually the largest horns of any antelope species, and they can spiral up to 6 feet. So this male has got sort of 1.5 twists in that horn. So they can go up to 2.5 twists in the horn. So yeah, very, very impressive. Obviously quite a feat to be able to move around in the environment, especially moving through kind of thicker areas. They literally have to lie those horns back against their back in order to move through areas. And the name kudu actually stems from the San people, and that's how they essentially pronounced it, and that's where the name comes from. Scientific name is actually from Greek. So tragus is a he goat, and then the strepus part of it means twisting, and keris horn, so referring to the twisting horns of the males. So here they have a very loud, deep bark. Often people don't believe that it's being made by an antelope. Yeah, very deep warning bark. And yeah, we'll be seen nibbling. They are pretty much exclusively browsers, meaning that they feed on woody tree matter, not grasses. And also quite partial to these quite thorny bushes, nibbling in between to get to the highly nutritious leaves. This is a classic what big ears you have. So they have these enormous ears, and that's one of their greatest mechanisms of detecting predators. You watch, these ears will move in all directions all the time, very, very alert and aware. So this is a female. And as I showed in the earlier pictures of the zebras licking the salt, these kudu were doing exactly the same thing in this picture. So there's some sort of nutrient deficiency in their diet, and so they're actually getting their salts from the soil. And then this was just a particularly nice, there was particularly nice light on this kudu, and he was above us. So we were actually sitting sort of below. He was up on a bit of a hill, and then kind of gave us a bit of a nice display. He sort of put his head down, and it was just a little bit of a different angle. But you'll see they have these sort of stripes, not particularly well developed stripes. And in this context, it doesn't really look like it would break up their outline. But when they're in a wooded environment, which is much more traditionally where they live, it breaks up that outline, and they honestly can disappear. You'll think it's impossible, but it really is possible that now you see me, now you don't. So another group of these spiral horned antelopes is an antelope called an nyala, and these are really very pretty antelope, very different male and females. So extremely what we call sexually dimorphic. So the bulls are really big, and the females ewes are substantially smaller. So the males, until about 14 months of age, look identical to the females, and then they start to develop their male discoloration, where they get these sort of orangey color socks, and then this beautiful chocolate brown rest of their coat, and this quite thick mane, lovely facial markings. And they do this really bizarre dance. So this is males sizing up each other to avert fighting. So male nyala will fight, and they can fight quite aggressively, but one of the ways of trying to establish dominance without fighting is doing these displays, puffing themselves up, doing this really strange stiff-legged walk in slow motion. And it's really, can I show a display of dominance where one will back down and therefore we don't have to get engaged in a fight? So this is just showing that sort of transition from when they're very small and going through that coloration, and then as they get to that sort of 1 year, 14-month mark, how they then start to change their color substantially. So this is an adult female. So yeah, very pronounced stripes on the female. Again, creatures of these relatively thick habitats, and so breaking up their outline. This is just a youngster who was peeking out at us from behind some trees. Just really quite sweet. And then the last of the spiral-horned antelope that we get in this part of southern Africa is a bushbuck. So much smaller than kudu and nyala, and doesn't have stripes, just has some spots on its rump. So this is a male. Only the males have horns as well. In areas where you have very high nyala concentrations, like we do, for example, where I'm based in Natal, the bushbuck are outcompeted by the nyala because the nyala are bigger and more dominant, and they compete for exactly the same habitat. And so it's quite tough on bushbuck. So you tend to have higher populations of bushbuck in areas where you don't have as many nyala. So another picture of a male. Those horns are incredibly sharp, and these antelope can actually be quite dangerous. The males, especially when they're breeding, can be really quite aggressive, and those horns are particularly dangerous. And this sort of a young female, so you can see a couple of very pale stripes, but characteristic white on the legs, and those lovely little dots. So unlike some antelope when they give birth, where the youngster will follow mom immediately, like impala, with bushbuck, the mother will clean and hide the newborn calf, and then she will visit it on a regular basis and to allow it to suckle, and then she will actually eat its dung so that no scent remains to attract predators to where it is. Only when the calf is about 4 months old, then it will start to accompany its mother, and it will no longer be left hiding. But that is a common practice, the sort of lying up of the youngster. And then the last animal that I kind of thought that I would share is a very small little antelope known as a steenbok, which literally translates from Afrikaans into stone buck. And that's because one of the things it does when it thinks it's been detected is it freezes. So this is a much smaller antelope than any of the others. And this is a little male. So they'll often form these monogamous pairs of a male and female. Highly, highly territorial. But they have these very small territories, which can be literally sort of 30 by 30 meters, which they defend pretty aggressively. And one of the interesting things that they do is, and this young male was actually sort of caught in the act, is they will defecate to mark territory. But then they will like a cat will do, they scrape soil over their droppings. And it does probably one of two things. Um, it will retain the moisture and scent for other steenbok to be able to detect. Um, so that means that when you're having to mark out a territory, you have to do it less often. And what's interesting is that steenbok don't necessarily have to drink free water. They will drink if it's available, but they can get it from their food. Um, and you obviously lose a lot of moisture in dung, and so it makes sense. You've kind of got a bit of a water balance going on here. You don't have to dung as often to mark territory by covering it to keep it moist longer. It's helping your water balance. Also leaving less of a visual marker for potential predators. Um, so yes, there may still be some scent, but there's less of a visual marker, which when you think about that these animals are living in a very, very small space, is probably a good thing, because they're living within this sort of 30 meter by 30 meter small area, and you don't want to give your presence away to predators too willingly. And then this is also another my what big ears you have. So this is a female, and as you can see, doesn't have the horns, but still has those incredibly big ears. Again, one of their biggest senses is hearing, and so they're always twitching those ears, listening for any sound that may indicate they're at threat. And that was just another giraffe sunset picture, because they do really well at those. And yeah, thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to try and answer any questions that anyone might have. Thanks, Rob.
All right, Lorraine, thank you. So, before we start in with the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. So, let's get to some of these questions. Um, are zebras related to donkeys in any way?
Um, no, they're not. They're not related to donkeys. The relationship is very strongly towards horses. Um, However, like you can have a situation where you'll have horses and donkeys that will interbreed. So that can happen. If you could similarly have a situation with zebra and donkeys, but they would produce sterile offspring. So a mule is sterile, and therefore it's not a viable animal. So they are related enough to be able to mate, but not to produce viable offspring.
Got it, thank you. So, how do giraffes protect themselves against lions or other predators?
Primarily by kicking. So they have an extremely powerful kick, and that is really their primary defense. They are formidable. They're a formidable opponent, and it's lions really, however, in certain areas, have learned specific tactics to hunt giraffe, where they hunt in sort of specific group patterns. But yeah, they will kick, and I mean they would quite easily from one kick kill a lion if they placed it correctly.
Wow, that's very interesting. So, are giraffes are they vulnerable to breaking their legs, or are their legs very strong?
Um, so I think it depends on the terrain, um, but I mean I've been involved in this environment for nearly 20 years. Um, and I've only had a situation twice, I think, where there's been that I have observed a giraffe with a broken leg. So, yes, when you've got legs that long, there's definitely a risk, but their bone density is very high. And so, I think it's more of an unfortunate event rather than a common occurrence that they break their legs.
So, so giraffes aren't necessarily vulnerable to tripping and falling. They're pretty well coordinated then.
They are, but one of the tactics that predators that have worked out, they will try and chase them onto either rocky ground. I've also watched predators try and chase them onto tarred roads, so roads that have a paved surface, which makes them slip, and then they lose their coordination, and that's one of the tactics where lions have learned to hunt giraffes is that they push them onto an uneven or a very smooth substrate, and then their coordination is not so good.
Great. Thank you for addressing that. So let's talk about the kudu for a second. Do the males shed their horns annually?
No. So your deer have got antlers, which obviously are shed annually. Our antelope, the horn is actually a bony structure attached to the skull. So they have a bone core inside, and then they have what we call a keratin sheath over the top of that bony core, and that's the dark black that you see. Um, but they cannot they cannot shed them because they are literally attached to the skull. They're part of the skull.
Great. Good to know. So Lorraine, tell me, is there any one animal outside of the big five that you find particularly fascinating?
Sure, that's a really good question. I mean, I happen to love giraffe. I really just think they are such unique animals. So I think they would probably be like top of my list
Great.
if I had
Thank
to
you.
pick one.
If you had to. Um, how about a zebra kick? Would a zebra kick kill a lion, or do they have other ways to defend themselves?
Um, Again, I mean their kick would pack less of a punch than that from a giraffe, but they could seriously injure a lion if they placed the kick correctly. Um, but yes, I mean kicking is probably their primary defense against lion predation. Um,
Great.
and you'll see lions are, when they're hunting things like zebra, they're actually very selective. So they will look for either the young or the weak. Um, they will rarely go after a stallion in its prime, um, unless it's, a particularly big pride. Um, but they'll generally single out one of the weaker ones. Um,
Great. Thank you. Will the plains zebra mate with other zebra species?
They certainly could, but they are geographically isolated. So it would be a very unnatural situation where they came together. But yes, they belong to the same genus, so they could interbreed.
Great. Well, thank you, Lorraine. Unfortunately, that's going to be the last question that we do have for today. So I'd like to hand it back to you for your closing comments.
Um, yeah, just to say thank you once again to whoever tuned in to listen. And also just that I'm really excited. I'm starting my first NatHab secluded South Africa on the 1st of July. Um, so, yeah, hopefully some people will be able to join that. And yeah, I'm looking forward to that experience again. So thanks very much, Rob.
Lorraine, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. Now, if you are interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, please give us a call at the number on your screen, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including our registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude today's webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.